welcome everybody. We will get started. My name is Reid Smith. I'm co-CEO of Ochre Education and Impact Assessment, and I'm very excited to be able to join you this evening. For those people who are joining us live, thanks so much for making time for us this afternoon / this evening on the Eastern Coast. We know that it's a tricky time sometimes with family, so we're hopeful that this session is going to be a really useful one for you and your teams. Today we're going to be discussing developing and using common assessment tasks. We'll be building on some of the ideas that were first developed in our previous webinar, and hopefully there'll be some aspects that can be used by you and your team relatively quickly. We're aiming for around about 30 or 40 minutes in our session today. And there'll be some time at the end for some questions. So if you're thinking about something in particular, you can pop it into the chat as we go along, or you can save it up for the end of our session today. On behalf of Impact Assessment, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we all join today, which for me is the Wadawurrung people. I'm here in Patilla, just north of Ballarat, and we'd like to pay our respects to elders past and present and welcome any First Nations people who are joining us on our session today. So really, the purpose of today is to discuss this idea of common assessment tasks, so assessment tasks that are used across multiple classrooms, how you might develop them and how you might use them, and some of the key considerations when you're thinking about using common assessment tasks. One of the things that we're going to be leaning on quite heavily during our session today is our framework for decision making that we have here at Impact Assessment. Really, the way that we conceptualize the use of curriculum and data is through how data can support our decision making and how it can support our decision making for individual students, for instruction for entire classes, but also how we can refine our curriculum. So our starting point whenever we're working with data is with the curriculum. So here at Impact Assessment, we're thinking a lot about what the plan is. So you as a teacher, as a school leader, you will have a plan somewhere at your school, a plan for teaching and learning in your school, thinking about what it is that is being taught in each of your lessons, in each of your subject areas, in each of your year levels, and how it's going to be taught. And at different schools, you'll have different maturity of that plan, just how specific your curriculum is, but really it's the bedrock upon which everything else is based. So whenever you've got a plan, we need to think about how effectively have students learnt the what. So if we think about the plan as the what it is that our students should know and be able to do as a result of a sequence of learning, then we're really trying to think about and measure how effectively students have learnt that. So it's no use us just having a plan and throwing information out there and then not measuring what students actually know. And really that's the role of impact assessment. So as we're conceptualizing this platform and the information that's coming back, we're thinking about what is your plan as a school? And then how do we know if that plan is actually working? Once we have that information, that assessment data, it helps us make a variety of different judgments based on some questions that we think are key questions. So the first one is obviously, have students mastered the what? So once we've got our information back from our assessment task that's linked to a curriculum, then hopefully what we find is that, yes, indeed, our students have learnt the what. They know the things that we hope that they know. They're able to do the things that we're hoping that they're able to do as a result of our sequence of learning. However, there'll be some cases in which we ask this question of the data, have the students mastered the what? And it comes back with no. And we've got a follow-up question once we have that no is the what actually in the curriculum? And sometimes we find that when we go back to our curriculum based on the assessment data, we haven't explicitly taught this piece of knowledge, or we haven't taught the students how to perform this skill that we know is really important. And so in those particular cases, when we've got the what not being taught within the curriculum, then we need to have some sort of way of being able to refine our plan. So if we've measured our skill and our knowledge, we find that the students don't know that knowledge or they can't perform that skill, and then we check our curriculum and it's not in there, then obviously our feedback cycle is back to the school curriculum. However, sometimes when we check the curriculum, it's actually in there. So theoretically, our students should be able to do what it is that we're asking them to do. So there's something that we need to point back to in terms of our instruction. So we've got some of the information, or we've got a plan for teaching that knowledge or that skill, but it's not as effective as it could be. And so when we're thinking about our common assessments, the place in this map that we're really focusing on is this top section. So we're thinking carefully about what is the plan, and we're thinking carefully about the assessment that we're drawing out from our students, this data on what students know and are able to do, because it's going to help us make a judgment about what to do next. And our common assessment task really sits across those two areas. What is the plan? And then how are we going to measure whether students have actually learnt the things that they should have learnt? So our starting point really when we're thinking about common assessment tasks is to have a common definition of what a common assessment task is. So when we're thinking about it here at Impact Assessment, we think that common assessment tasks are tasks that are used unaltered across all classes for a particular subject. And I think that bracketed term is one that's really important for us to consider, that when we're thinking about our unaltered common assessment tasks, this is a really important aspect, because sometimes what can happen is we're going to have an assessment task and it's notionally supposed to go out to all of our classes in a particular year level, but then we tend to change things or adjust things for one class and adjust it for another class. And instead of it being a common assessment task, it's relatively common. And that defeats some of the purpose of this assessment task. Common assessment tasks are typically sat at the same time under the same conditions. So what we're trying to do with our common assessment tasks is we're trying to reduce the variation that's not associated with what students know and are able to do. So when we're talking about sitting the assessment task at the same time, it doesn't have to be at exactly the same moment in the day, but it needs to be relatively similar. But the same conditions need to apply, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in our presentation tonight. And the last aspect or definitional element of common assessment tasks is that it is written from the intended curriculum. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by written from the intended curriculum. And why would we use common assessment tasks? Common assessment tasks allow for comparison between classes studying a particular subject, like Year 8 history. You may have 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 different classes that are each studying Year 8 history at a particular point in time, and it allows for us to have comparison in the levels of achievement between those different classes. Now, the reason that we might want that information is we can then use that data to get a sense of what skills and knowledge students have mastered and what students still need to learn. So we're trying to get a sense about what students know and are able to do at a particular point in time to think about what our next instructional decisions are going to be. And then the reason why we might want a common assessment task, so an assessment task that sits across multiple classes, is that this information across classes is really useful because it helps us identify where one class may have elements of instruction that they can share with other teachers. So our purpose really with common assessment tasks isn't necessarily to say which class is better and which class is worse, or which teacher is better or which class is worse, but rather for us to get a sense about, well, how are we going as a group of teachers working together with a cohort of students? And are there points of difference in the instruction between different classes that we might be able to share so that we can all improve our instruction, that we can all have more tools in our kit bag? So tonight I'm going to be outlining 4 key stages in the use of common assessment tasks. The first step is shared curriculum. So I'm going to talk a little bit about shared curriculum and why that's so important. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about common assessment itself, so what it means to develop common assessment and some hints and tips around that. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on common conditions because it's often an aspect that's forgotten or neglected when we're thinking about common assessment, and it can have a significant impact on the results that we get. And then I'll spend a short amount of time talking a little bit about data analysis and its link to the questions that we're trying to answer. But our starting point really is the shared curriculum. And I really like how Becky Allen from the UK talks about it, that the ghost in the data machine is curriculum. And it's often the hidden part of our data analysis process is the curriculum that we begin with. So if we go back to our map, the way that we conceptualize how we can consider data here at Impact Assessment, the plan is our starting point. So having some sort of a plan, the school curriculum, that is where all of our assessment information is drawn from, and it's our reference point. It's the bedrock upon which everything else is built. And so really when we're thinking about having a common assessment task, our starting point really should be starting with the school curriculum. Because when we've got a good common assessment task, we need to first have an agreed curriculum. We need across each of the classes that are teaching a particular subject area, like Year 8 history, we need to have some form of agreed curriculum that we're all teaching these particular pieces of knowledge, this particular skill and this particular understanding. Because when we develop our shared assessment task, we're going to be assessing a particular domain of that agreed curriculum. So this blue dot represents all of the knowledge and skills that a particular assessment task is going to assess. And you'll notice two things. First of all, that blue dot is contained entirely within that agreed curriculum. There's no part of that assessment task that sits outside the agreed curriculum that is common between each of those classes. That's really, really important, because we don't want to have some classes that have been taught certain things that are being assessed, but other classes that have not, because then you've got students who haven't had the opportunity to learn some of these knowledge and skills that they are being assessed on. And so it muddies the data waters that come further downstream. The second thing that I want you to notice is that blue dot doesn't encompass the entirety of the agreed curriculum. If you've got an agreed curriculum, it's almost impossible to have an assessment task that's going to assess absolutely everything that sits within that agreed curriculum. Instead, we make really judicious decisions about what it is that we're going to test on an assessment task, and that can't be 100% of it. So here, the circle representing my assessment task maybe occupies around about 30% of the shared curriculum. There'll be a lot of times in which your assessment task will occupy even less than that. So I hope that you can see here that when we're putting together our common assessment task, the first port of call for us is to have a common understanding of what our curriculum is, a shared curriculum between each of those classes in our particular subject. And really, grain size matters, right? When we're talking about having an agreed curriculum, it can't be Year 8 algebra, right? It can't be this particular content description on the Australian curriculum, or it can't be a particular outcome on the New South Wales syllabus. We actually need to be more fine-grained from that. If we've got a grain size that has a high level of abstraction, like Year 8 algebra or linear function, there are so many possible things that could fit within that really broad bucket that it makes it really difficult for teachers to know exactly what it is that they're supposed to teach. And it makes it even more difficult to write an assessment task that's going to apply to all aspects of that subject area. Now, when we're considering this idea of agreed curriculum, in some places it's going to be something relatively simple, like a list of essential knowledge or essential skills. So they can be dot points, like in the screenshot that I've got here. So some sort of outcomes document that describes what it is that our students should know and be able to do at the end of a sequence of learning. It might be a little bit more sophisticated like that. It might have, say, some learning intentions. So your shared curriculum is a series of learning intentions that are developed or described by your team. In some particular cases, you might have something that's a little bit more specific. So we know that some schools have shared lesson resources that go down to the lesson level. So you might have shared slide decks or something similar. You may also use a textbook. So it might be that you say, okay, your your shared or your agreed curriculum is actually chapter 8 from this particular textbook. And so you know as a teacher within your school or as an assessment writer that anything that sits within that chapter of the textbook is fair game or is comprising that agreed curriculum. So this development of a shared understanding and agreed curriculum is something that's really, really important. If you do not have that agreed curriculum, then it's almost impossible for you to develop a common assessment task, and then it is absolutely impossible to have data that is developed or comes out of that common assessment task that's going to be really useful for you and your particular schools. And I want to talk a little bit more about that now. So we've talked a little bit about our shared curriculum, and now I want to talk about the common assessment task itself. One of the things that I learned when I was leading a department at a school when we didn't have an agreed curriculum is that we often got ourselves into trouble around developing an assessment task because we were thinking about things in terms of, say, year 8 algebra. And what tended to happen was we'd have class A, they would teach these knowledge of skills that would be roughly in this area of year 8 algebra. And maybe the teacher from class A writes the assessment, right? So they write an assessment that reflects their teaching within their particular class, how they've happened to conceptualize year 8 algebra. They then send it off to the teachers of classes B and C, and the class B teacher, they've taught many things that are similar to class A, but they might have spent a little bit more time on some areas. They haven't covered some things that class A have. So what the teacher in class B says to class A is they say, that's a wonderful assessment task, but geez, we didn't get that much time really to spend on this particular skill. So can we take that particular skill out? And then that assessment task gets sent to the teacher of class C, and that class C teacher says, oh, that's fantastic. I really like what you've done there. But geez, I really heavily emphasized the way that we simplified algebraic expressions. So I'd love to see some additional questions on that. And it'd be great if you could take this particular question out when we considered some ways that we could apply some of that algebra to rates type questions. And so what you ended up with was an assessment task. The assessed domain was actually the intersection of these 3 circles, right? So it was where there was an overlap between what class A was teaching with what class B was teaching and with what class C was teaching. And we like to call that the negotiated assessment problem. So what happens here is we don't really have an agreed curriculum. So instead, we negotiate a curriculum, which is the intersection of what we've decided to teach in each of those 3 classes. And while that doesn't necessarily seem like a problem this year, is that year on year, that becomes a bigger and bigger problem, right? That you may change teachers from one year to another. That means that what is taught in class B when they change teacher changes again. So your assessed domain changes and you have a lot of these fluctuations and you don't have consistency. So when you don't start with an agreed curriculum, then you're forced into this negotiated assessment problem and you don't necessarily have an assessment task that's going to be written that reflects what it is that you intended for your students to know and be able to do at the end of a sequence of learning. So when we're thinking about those common assessments, if we've got an agreed curriculum in place, then we move to starting to develop some common assessments. And if we think back to that original diagram where we have our grey agreed curriculum box, we're then trying to find our assessed domain. When speaking to schools who've developed some common assessment tasks and how we've developed that here at Impact Assessment, we've got a number of hints and tips that might be useful for you and your colleagues. So first of all, write the assessment from the intended curriculum and not from this negotiation with teachers. So what that means is going back to those curriculum documents, whatever they happen to look like in your particular schools, and you're writing it from that document. You're not writing it from your teacher's conceptualization of that curriculum, how it's actually playing out in the classroom. 2 ways that you might be able to do this. Some schools write the assessment prior to starting to teach the unit. So one of the benefits of this is when you write the assessment first, then that tends to hold your teaching together because people know that that assessment has already been written, so there's no place to negotiate it further down the line. One of the negatives of writing the assessment prior to starting to teach the unit, particularly if it's been written by the teachers who are teaching those classes this year, is sometimes you can start to teach to the test, right? You know what's going to be on the assessment task. And so your teachers may unintentionally just give greater emphasis to particular concepts and skills and de-emphasize others because they know what's going to be assessed later on. So to solve that particular problem, what some schools have done is to have an independent teacher who's familiar with the subject matter but not teaching the unit this year write the assessment. Now, that has a range of real benefits because you have something that's written at arm's length, but it can be a real pain sometimes for a school to organise, and sometimes it can be a bit contentious. So if you're thinking about having this independent assessment being written, you need to be aware of two things. One is that it can create some logistical difficulties. The second one is sometimes you can get some challenges. So that independent teacher writes the assessment task, it's delivered to the teachers who are teaching those lessons maybe a day or a couple of days before they sit it. And then there may be some challenge to that teacher who's written that particular assessment task about, gee, does this actually reflect the domain? So there's just a few challenges that you might think about. Once you've written that common assessment task, so it might be written at the start of the unit, it might be written by an independent teacher, but there are two hints or tips that we believe will make that common assessment task much more effective for your teams. The first one is have someone complete and mark that assessment prior to photocopying, right? So sometimes what happens is we write the questions and we've got a bit of an idea about how the questions are going to work in our head, but if we don't pass it on to somebody else and have them, first of all, complete the assessment and then mark the assessment, we don't pick up some of the errors that can sit within that assessment. And we believe those two processes, completing the assessment and marking the assessment, are really important ones. Completing the assessment, first of all, to make sure the questions make sense, because you really don't get a sense of that until somebody else has tried to complete that paper. And second of all, to try and mark the assessment. Sometimes you come up with a mark allocation and it makes sense until you actually have the final output of an answer when you see that in actual fact this doesn't quite make sense. The marking guide's not going to work. And this last point that I think is really, really important if you want your data to be robust at the end when you're trying to analyze that data is make sure you have some sort of marking guidance. This is really crucial for useful data down the line. The more fine-grained that you can make your marking guidance, the more likely it is that they're marked in a common way, and it's much more likely that the data at the end of the process is really useful. Now, there are two ways that you can avoid having to have really robust marking guidance. One is to have moderation, so really getting your teachers into one room, co-marking questions, co-marking papers is what some schools do. Sometimes they'll write the marking guidance based on that moderation session. The second thing that you can do is, and a lot of schools do this, is they take turns, each of the teachers marking the full set of assessments. So it might be this time around, I'm going to mark all the classes, year 8 algebra assessments, but I know that there are 3 other classes, so that those 3 assessments are going to be marked by another member of the team, right? So you've got that consistent interpretation of marking. But these hints or tips are really important for you as you're developing common assessments. In a future webinar, we're going to break these down into much more concrete steps. So we'll take you through how each of these dot points work. So going back to our overview, we've got our shared curriculum in place. We've written our common assessment, and we're just going to take a short aside around common conditions. Common conditions are really important for us to consider. The common assessments have to be completed in the same conditions in each class. We found in our school that we'd make all of this effort to come up with a common assessment task. We'd control all the variables we could, and then there'd be elements that we hadn't necessarily considered, that we hadn't written down, that actually made data analysis difficult for us to do as a group of teachers. So some conditions that you might want to consider. So first of all, when is the task scheduled? So ideally, as I discussed earlier on in the presentation today, ideally we want that task to be completed at a relatively similar time during the year. Might ideally on the same day, but certainly within the same week if we can. What we don't want to have is one class completing it 1 week and then 2 weeks later another class completing it, or next term. The scheduling of that task needs to be really similar. The second one is being firm on what is the duration of the task. So is it a 40-minute task? Is it a 20-minute check-in? Does it go for an hour? Thinking carefully too about what happens if students don't finish the task. Are we going to start this task at the start of the lesson, or is there going to be a bit of pre-teaching that occurs at the start of the lesson? So that duration of the task is really important, because you can run into problems if you haven't decided what happens if a student has to learn early, or if you don't get it finished over the course of the lesson, or it comes back and then you find out that somebody has accidentally given 55 minutes instead of 45 minutes for the task. Another important condition are the materials and equipment available to students. Be really clear about what it is that students have access to. Is it open book or closed book? Do students have access to their laptops? Do they have some working out paper? Do they have calculators, rulers, protractors? What are the things that students have access to? Because if you don't specify that on the common assessment task, then you'd be surprised how often teachers will interpret that in different ways, and you'll find that some students will have had access to something that other students did not. And the last aspect, and it doesn't sound like much, but your classroom setup. So we found in our school, in the end, we came up with a common classroom setup that we'd for test type situations, or situations where students could be completing the task independently. We asked that our students would sit at the end of tables. So we'd have students paired up on the ends of tables rather than having them sit in their normal class rows. We just felt that really aided the teacher and students in helping to focus on the task. So really thinking carefully about how your classroom is set up can make a difference to the data that's gained at the end. And our last step, whenever we're working with our common assessment task, is the data analysis. So we've gone to great lengths to try and get data that's going to be comparable from one class to the next. We've developed this shared curriculum. We've got our common assessment task. We've defined these common conditions upon which the assessment is going to be sat. And now we come to sit down and analyze the data. And really our guiding principle here is that data analysis should start with a question you're trying to answer. So whenever we're putting our common assessment task together, we're thinking about, well, what is it that we want to know? What information are we trying to find out from our students? And what are we going to do with that information? Because that's going to shape the type of task that we design. And it's also going to shape the way that we analyze and look at the data that comes out. So some questions that you might have in your teams as you're starting to analyze the data. First of all, pretty basic: have students mastered this skill or knowledge? So there may be some skills that you know that your students definitely need to have, that they should have mastered at this point. So you're making a judgment across the entire cohort and maybe between classes. Have students actually mastered this key skill or knowledge? You might be asking about whether there's a significant difference between the achievement of different classes as an entire test, or on particular components of the test, even on particular questions. And then you might be asking yourself, is this actually expected? So you might know that Class A on average is stronger in their historical knowledge than Class B, but you might notice that Class B in particular skills or particular pieces of knowledge, they are stronger than Class A. So it's a good time for us to ask the question, what's going on here? This is an unexpected piece of data. Let's unpack it a little bit. What instruction might have led to this particular piece of information? Is there something that we can learn from the teaching in the class with the highest achievement? So often when we're looking at our data, it's not just about the students, we're thinking about our curriculum. So remembering our plan constitutes not just what it is that our students should know and be able to do as a result of a sequence of learning, but also the steps that we take as teachers. What instructional strategies are we going to be using? And perhaps there's something in that data that identifies an instructional technique or a question that a teacher has asked, or a way of modeling or guiding students through a particular process that might be useful for other people in the team to know. Some of the most valuable data analysis meetings that you can be involved in are ones in which we identify perhaps somewhere where an instructional strategy might have been more effective than others, and that teacher has gotten up in front of our teaching group to go through exactly how they modeled or guided students' knowledge and learning over the course of 10 or 15 minutes so that we can learn something new from our colleagues. And one thing that you might also ask is how similar or different is this result or combination of results compared to the same questions or the same task in previous years. So you may run this common assessment task every year, and maybe part of your data analysis is to examine how this looks from one year to the next. So this data analysis can come from a variety of different sources. So you might have a spreadsheet or an information management system a little bit like this. This is from impact assessment that gives you some information about individual classes, might give you information about multiple classes. But if you're looking for some more ideas about how you might look at assessment data to make instructional decisions, we've got a webinar that we've run previously that runs for about 3/4 of an hour that might be useful for you to see. Again, it's a recorded webinar, so please check it out. So in today's short session, we've been really trying to outline the key components we see in the development of common assessment tasks, and then how we might be able to gain good data and use that data. So it starts off with the shared curriculum. So thinking carefully about how we communicate what a shared curriculum it is between different classrooms and how similar or different we expect it to be. From that, we write a common assessment, trying to avoid the negotiated assessment problem, and thinking about ways in which we might be able to develop that initial assessment so that it actually assesses the knowledge and skills on that shared curriculum. We're thinking and articulating the common conditions that those assessment tasks are being sat in, and then we've got some form of data analysis. We know that that process of data analysis will be more informative because of those preceding 3 steps: the shared curriculum, the common assessment, and the common conditions. We'll be offering some more free webinars in the future that provide some more fine-grained analysis of some of those steps that we've articulated in our session tonight. And just for those who are thinking about their assessment tasks from impact assessment, just so that you're aware, if you're thinking about using impact assessment, we've got some pro rata pricing that's available for 2026. Contact us at contact@impactassessment.org.au to discuss. If you join us prior to May 22nd, we have our semester assessments available for foundation through to year 10 in English, maths, science, and HASS. So you have the opportunities to sit those during the window. Probably just as exciting, we also have fully funded places on our Teach Well and Impact Assessment courses. So through Teach Well, we're offering for secondary schools, we've got secondary maths and secondary science masterclass series. So that's over 9 months. We have 5 spaced workshop days with video coaching and structured reflection, access to many hundreds of instructional videos, and also free access to impact assessment for the duration of the program. We've got cohorts starting this term and in term 3. We've got some that are in person and some that are online. I've got a QR code there. If you're interested and you've got an ICSIA below 1,000, there's the opportunity to apply for one of those fully funded places. So please make contact with us. And then finally from us, just a quick QR code that takes you to our website if you want to find out a little bit more about us here at Impact Assessment. So I'll just leave that on the screen for the moment. I will just return back to the slide with the other QR code because I can see some people in the chat who are looking to get a copy of it. If you've got questions, things that you are thinking about or that you would like to know, please pop it into the chat. We've got about 10 minutes in which I'm happy enough to try and answer some of your questions. There may be some others that you have that I can take on notice. Please, we're making a recording of today's session, so if there are things that you want your colleagues to see or that you want to watch back later, please feel free to watch the video. We'll make it freely available and send out a link a little bit later on this week. I'll stop sharing now. All right, folks, I hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope today has been a useful one for you, and look out for a copy of that recording coming soon. Good night.